Hello, my name is James Cook. I'm with the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm recording this video for the social science program to talk about activists, activism, the social form called a social movement, and what it is that moves a social movement containing people who are socially active. When we think about the idea of a solution to some kind of social problem or a change in some kind of social situation as coming from a social movement, there are, it turns out, many stories about where those social movements come from and what they're driven by. And those stories are theories. A theory is a coherent explanation of some kind of behavior. And we're going to consider today the many theories of social movements that are out there in academics. So let's talk about what a social movement is and how that is different from an activist. A social movement is a group of people, not just a single person, acting with some continuity to promote or resist a change in their society or group. It is some form of either collective deviance to what the norm is currently, or a counter movement to resist that active deviance. So, just as our culture is a set of practices, beliefs, and values, and just as society is made of institutions which promote certain activities and interests and priorities, a social movement is a pattern within a society dedicated to changing that arrangement, either a cultural arrangement or an institutional arrangement. That's a large-scale social form. And an activist can be considered to be a person who is part of a social movement. That is an individual who is part of something greater than themselves. So, if a social movement is really collective in nature, then we can think about why and how such movements form. And if sociology is the study of these larger scale forms, then there should be some kind of sociological principles that lead us to a coherent story about social movements. So, one of the first social theorists of protest was Gustav LeBon of France, from the 19th to the 20th century, at the turn of the century, writing a book called The Crowd. And LeBon says, when you get enough people together, you pack them in a tightly enough space, they seem to take on a behavior that is not simply the addition of each person's thoughts and wishes and desires, but it seems to take on a life of its own. And this is because something about a crowd exerts a powerful influence over a member of that crowd. It's as if there is some kind of larger scale wish that is passing like a virus through contagion through the crowd. It is also as if a crowd somehow disinhibits its members so that the normal social constraints are lifted in a crowd, says LeBon. And therefore that veneer of civil rationality is stripped from humans, and they become part of this moving, shifting crowd that in which the actions of that collectivity may not reflect the moral values or preferences of any one of its members. The idea is that this crowd is irrational. It's a mob. And therefore, when you get a bunch of people together, you really ought to be careful, according to LeBon, about what happens next. It is a maddening crowd, right? So, in an example of contagion that is often used to uh, exemplify Gustav LeBon's contagion theory of crowds, we can go back to 1979 and the music group The Who. They were going to perform. They never managed to in Cincinnati on December 3rd, 1979. What happened was that it took a while for people to get through from this line outside the stadium into the stadium itself to see the Who perform. And so the crowd began to sway and rock rhythmically, and it had been heard that people started rhythmically chanting, push, push, push. Well, it turned out that there was pushing that was going on. There was movement going on. 11 people died. It was initially reported that they were trampled to the ground. It looked like they ended up getting pressured and stacked on top of one another. Some individuals were not able to breathe, and 11 died. This is something that nobody, we can imagine, planned to do that day when they showed up to see The Who play rock music. And so this seems to be a perfect example of a crowd behavior. Second behavior actually could be seen from this past Saturday. Now, this is an image of part of the Washington, D.C. Pride Parade. This is outside the Filipino embassy, where members of the Filipino American community are dressing in sashes of bright colors with rainbow pendants to celebrate Pride Day, which is an annual occurrence in Washington, D.C., with a little music. So that seems like a happy scene, right? And in fact, I was there on Saturday, June 8th, and I saw a number of people in celebration, just like here at the Filipino embassy. And there were flags flying with lots of rainbows that were put outside of businesses. The police had erected barricades, and they were not to stop the Pride Parade, but rather to channel it and protect it from people who were coming in from the crowds to watch, to protect it from being blocked off by all the people who had come to happily watch that day. This is what I saw leading up to the Pride Parade. If you look in the bottom picture, there's a banner there, and it's got corporate sponsors, which is very different than the scene that had occurred 50 years ago in June in New York City, where what had been typical, which was that police would go into a private gay bar, they would arrest everybody there, and they would rough them up and beat them up. And that was in Stonewall in New York City in June of 1969. And what happened that day was that the people who were at the bar decided that they weren't going to take that harassment and violence from the police anymore, just because they were gay, and they began to resist. So this was the 50th anniversary Pride Parade. There was a period before then when these were pride marches, where they were defiant. They have since become celebratory, as there has been a social movement in the public opinion and in the culture, becoming more acceptable of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and more generally termed queer population in the United States. However, there was an example of contagion that I also saw that day. And you can see reports of this in the national newspapers, but I saw it in person. A crowd coming down the street, moving. I remarked to my partner like a school of fish, and they were shouting, "Shooter, run!" And 10 people were injured that day in the ensuing panic. Panic is the word that has been most often used to describe this. That connects back to Gustav LeBon's theory about a crowd being susceptible to an emotional reaction like panic. We can call it a panic for that day because we know that there actually was no active shooter. There was nobody who was shooting any gun. It's still a bit of a mystery as to what caused it. Was it the sound of a table closing? I saw tables being closed. Was it a balloon popping? There were a lot of balloons there. As I walked past the panicking protesters, paraders now, through to the place where they had just fled. There were people putting balloons away. That could have been it. But the point is that they developed a perception that there was a shooter when there was none, and acted, therefore, in this emotional response. They began shouting, "Shooter, run," and all of a sudden, everybody left that parade. And when I say everybody, the attendance was estimated at 400,000 people. So that's quite a lot of people who were running down many, many streets, on which I was just on one of them, as part of the Pride celebration in Washington, D.C., that very recent day. Is this in line with Gustav Le Bon's crowd theory, his contagion theory, which says this kind of idea runs through a crowd and it spreads like a disease, except very quickly, and we get these suggestions and this irrational response? Is that true? Are social movements just mobs driven mad without goals or organization? Well, there's some reasons to think that that might not be the case. For instance, if we follow this link, we'll be taken to a website. And that website is called Indie Media, or the Independent Media Center. It's been around for almost 20 years, and it is a website that has local chapters that work in Germany and in London, in the United States, and they describe activist happenings, right? So these occur all over the world, and through the Indie Media website, one is able to take a look at what's happening, learn information, and become more informed, at least from this movement's point of view. But this is not a mob. This is something that you learn from all on your own. Does that fit within the idea of a maddening crowd of people turning folks into an unruly mob? It doesn't seem to fit. We can also look back at that the Who concert, right, in 1979, in December of 1979, which Norms Johnson did in a social problems piece. Social Problems is a journal within sociology, and what Dr. Johnson's did was to look through police accounts that were collected by the police from those who were there, and found that a little bit more than 40% of people reported to the police that they had been giving help to others around, that they had been receiving help. A little bit more, again, a little bit more, over 40%, that they had been observing helping behavior. And when you take those three combined, any one of those, well over 3/4 of the people who reported to the police what had been happening in this awful situation in which more than 10 people were killed. They reported behavior that was not irrational, that was not crazy, that was not a mob. It was helping behavior. It was people engaging in just the sort of the behavior that they might do otherwise. So people weren't driven crazy by the crowd. Just as at the Indie Media website, people's discernment as individuals is encouraged. So those two pieces don't fit. If we think back, just before I move on a bit more, to the panic that I saw a few days ago at the DC Pride parade, that panic itself is not irrational. It's not crazy when you consider the history that is understood by the people who were attending that day of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people being harassed, being the victims of violence, sometimes being killed for who they are. Is it irrational to believe that there could be a shooter? Is it irrational when you hear someone shout, "Shooter, run," and you know you're at an LGBT celebratory event that is a mark of resistance, a celebration of a 50-year-old resistance, to believe that someone could be shooting in the crowd? Perhaps not. Perhaps people have their reasons for reacting the way they do, even when it turns out that there was no shooter there. So social movement theorists have taken LeBon and his idea, which is more than 100 years old now, and have decided it needs some reworking, some addition, another way of looking at things. So William Kornhauser comes around in World War II. And just as Gustav LeBon is reacting to the events in his recent past, the French Revolution, right, where the social order is turned over, where crowds did engage in violent activity, so Kornhauser is responding in 1959 to events in his recent past, what he sees in the globe, which is the Holocaust and the events leading up to World War II. How is it that you can have a movement of people that do things that we would not think that civilized people would otherwise normally do? So Kornhauser takes some ideas that are similar to LeBon's, but he kind of tweaks them. He turns them in another direction. And he terms this mass society theory. So a society is an organized grouping of people, not a disorganized grouping of people. But that organization has a particular form in modern society, which is one of mass, a whole lot of people densely packed together and socially isolated. And Kornhauser is interested in understanding the Holocaust as a social movement, Nazism as a social movement, fascism as a social movement. How do people come to follow fascists? How do people come to follow movements like the Nazis and believe in them and engage in extreme social movement behavior? So for him, the reason that the Holocaust happens as this seemingly unusual event is the emergence of large populations crammed into cities. Now, when you're writing in 1959, this is a development that is accelerating at that moment, certainly was accelerating at that moment in the 1940s, and really was less than 100 years old if you look at the population charts, that sharp upturn into larger and larger cities. And he says that's what happens when you get people together in cities. You get a lot of people, you pack them in closely together, and yet all those people moving to the cities are socially isolated. Why? Because they're surrounded by lots of people, but when you're in a city of 10 million people, you can't know them all. The few people you do know, they're likely to be somewhere else in the city at any one given time. And so most of the people you're surrounded by are strangers to you. And Kornhauser says that leads to this development of a new form of the sense of social isolation, a feeling of social insignificance. For human beings who are used to being in very small towns, in an agricultural setting where they know most people, to then move to cities where nobody knows your name, nobody cares about you, because they don't recognize you except as just another human body. What a way to feel insignificant. What a way to feel small. What a way to feel that you don't belong. And so for Kornhauser, all these individuals are not connected. And they yet are seeking connection because we are a social species. We get our sense of meaning through connection. And so we're eager to join some movement, any movement, just to feel that we belong to something, especially a movement that tells us who we are and what we're there for. So Nazism comes along. It gives people a reason to believe. It gives them something to believe in. It gives them some sense of identity. They can be in crowds and they can otherwise feel alone, but like everyone else around them, they can all believe the same thing and they have something to cheer for. Lest you think that makes absolutely no sense. American cities are organized around this principle today. Not Nazism, but we have these sports stadiums where 100,000 people at a time will get together and cheer for 10 people on a field that they insanely, it seems like, identify with. And they say, "We did it." Right? When they're just sitting there in the stands and everybody is cheering together for that one team. People will pay $100 for a ticket for the privilege of feeling that sense of belonging and purpose as their team plays the other team, the bad ones. They will swear together, right? There are even chants where people will swear, people will throw things on the field when the other team wins, when the bad guys wins. They're the ones that you have to hate. Well, for Kornhauser, that's what happens in cities, and it can be taken to an extreme when you have people who are isolated, and they can be co-opted in their isolation, their desire to belong to something. It can be a movement that tells them their purpose is that they are right, that they are good, that they are part of something bigger than themselves, such as the master race, and that others, outsiders, are the problem, and they need to be exterminated. That means, in this social movement theory, that just like for LeBon, where crowds are dangerous, for Kornhauser, big cities are dangerous places because the people within them are lost and alone and can be manipulated by movement leaders who understand this need for meaning, for belonging, for purpose that people in a big, big city can have. That's the theory. That's the story of William Kornhauser. And it suggests, to quote William Kornhauser from his 1959 book, that, quote, the greatest number of people available to mass movements will be found in those sections of society that have the fewest ties to the social order. So this is not just anybody within the city, but it's the rabble, right? It's those who don't have steady jobs. It's those who aren't in the leadership, because leadership can be like this elite group within a society where everybody knows everybody else, right? So it should be those without power, those without place within a city, especially susceptible to a mass movement. And yet, one of the things we actually see in scholarship on not just the Nazi movement, but other social movements, is that the Nazi movement in Germany actually had origins that were the opposite of what Kornhauser described. They were the educated and upper class who joined the Nazi leadership and took up the ranks of Nazi leadership. In the French Revolution, those who participated in revolutionary activities, going back to LeBon's time, turned out to have been members of pre-existing organizations. So it's not that those who weren't members of any organizations, who felt no sense of belonging, were eager to join the French Revolution. On the contrary, the people who got recruited were those who were already in some organization. Those who were in no organization before were less likely to participate. That's contrary to mass society theory. In the civil rights movement, similarly, the most successful organizers were those who had contacts within African American society in the 20th century, to churches, to Black institutions of higher education, historically Black colleges and universities, who had roots in neighborhoods, and they recruited through neighborhoods. They recruited through colleges. They recruited through segregated workplaces. They recruited through colleges and universities. They recruited through organizational networks of Black healthcare workers, Black lawyers. Again, the educated, again, those who are organized. They brought people into the movement through those organizations. They didn't go out and attract simply the dispossessed and those who were alone. And finally, we found, that was the work of Alden Morris, the work of Douglas McAdam and others indicates that those who continued to engage in activity in the civil rights movement were those who had the most ties to others within the movement. So connection actually matters in starting a movement, in recruitment to a movement, in leadership of a movement. Exactly what mass society theory predicts is not going to happen. So mass society theory is not proving to match too well the actual patterns of what a social movement organization does. So where does activism come from, if not from the emergence of a mass society? Well, deprivation theory comes along at about the same time that mass society theory does. And it says, it's possible that activism, in order to solve social problems, is not just this insane activity. It's not just simply a dangerous activity of a mob. It is not the desperate activity of those who are lonely and isolated, but is the very purposeful and rational activity of those who are experiencing deprivation, of not having what they need in order to get by. Deprivation is the lack of something important to a person or group of people, whether that thing is tangible, like food, or income to take care of one's family, or whether it's something intangible, like rights or respect. So the prediction or hypothesis of deprivation theory is that the more deprived a person is, or a class of people are, the more likely that they are to join a social movement and to participate. When things are worse off for you, you're going to be more likely to organize, right? And so that suggests that we should see social movements happen when deprivation for a group or for an entire society increases. And yet, there are some immediate objections that we can think of. The civil rights movement, for instance, was not primarily a successful movement of the late 1800s or the early 1900s. It was reached its primary success in the middle of the 20th century, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, which was a period when policy change had already started to arise, like the Voting Rights Act, like desegregation of schools, like desegregation of businesses. All of these things were starting to happen at the very moment when the social movement was at its peak. And yet earlier in the late 1800s, in the first half of the 20th century, when Jim Crow laws were at their worst, when the Ku Klux Klan was most active, violently repressing African Americans, the civil rights movement was not as active. That seems to actually be an inversion of deprivation theory. Consider the LGBT movement. Okay, if we think of that as another social movement. So I talked about 400,000 people showing up in Washington, D.C. for this Pride Parade, this commemoration of 50 years ago, a moment of resistance. The Pride Parades long ago were quite small compared to how they are now. If you take a look at this list that's been compiled of large LGBT events, they're now parades and they're festivals. And if we take a look at the largest ones, they're 4 million, 3.5 million, 2.3 million, 1.7 million. When are they? They're all within the last decade or so, a period in which LGBT rights around the world have been on the market increase, during a period in which cultural acceptance of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and otherwise queer people around the world has been growing incredibly strongly. We can look at polling report, which is a great way to look at the sense of popular opinion. And we can take a look at this idea of a gay or lesbian president, right? And you can take a look at, let's make this a little bit larger. A question that has been asked now and then. Okay, so between now and the 2020 political conventions, there will be discussion about qualifications of presidential candidates. Okay. And in 1958, they asked a question, if your party nominated a well-qualified man for president and he happened to be a Negro, would you vote for him? That was the term of the time. It was 53% no, and only 37% yes. It increased to 96%. You can ask the same question about Catholic, Hispanic, gay, or lesbian. What about that? Well, that question was asked in 1978. And in 1978, 66% of Americans, a representative sample of Americans, said no, they would not. Only 26% said they would. By this year, and in the last decade, that percentage had been inverted. Would you vote for a well-qualified person who was gay or lesbian? 76% now say yes, they would, and only 24% said they would not. So, but at that very moment in history, that's the moment when we have had huge pride parades commemorating this act of resistance. So how does that match with the idea of deprivation theory? According to deprivation theory, when things were a lot harder for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans, that would have been a generation ago. It would have been 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, heck, even 20 years ago, when to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans and out meant that you were much more often socially rejected. You were much more often discriminated against in the workplace. You were much more often subject to violence than you are nowadays. That is absolutely not erased, that kind of negative reaction, but it has been much lessened and reversed by a general support, not universal support, but general support. So why is the LGBT movement so strong now if deprivation theory holds? It's not consistent with the prediction. That's a problem. We see this over and over and over again with social movements. Well, some people come along about a generation ago, noticing patterns like this, and they say, let's make a bit of a change to this theory of activism. Let's call it relative deprivation theory. And they say what happens is that there's a difference between the deprivation that people expect and what they actually experience. So if you can imagine, before Stonewall, before 1969, if you can imagine the Jim Crow era for African Americans in the United States of the early 1900s, that was a period where actual deprivation was high, but that was pretty much expected. It was what you expected. And so the difference between what you experience and what you expect is not that high. If you get used to being oppressed, in other words, you get used to being deprived in some sense. If you're poor, but you expect to be poor, you don't expect anything more, then you're not going to be motivated to go out and act socially. On the other hand, what happens when things start to change? What happens when there's a civil rights movement that says, yeah, you are somebody, regardless of the color of your skin or who your ancestors were, and you have rights just like anybody else, and we're going to fight for them? What happens when that promise gets really high and then something happens to make people think, hey, what's going on there? What happens when lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in the United States start to see marriage equality starting to happen, and they start to see themselves appearing on TV shows as fictional characters, where a generation ago there wasn't a single one on TV before Ellen DeGeneres. So you may not believe this if you weren't watching TV a generation ago, but it was true. There were no lesbian, gay, bisexual, and there wasn't even the word transgender as characters on television. You couldn't see, you were invisible, and then all of a sudden you become visible, and then something happens to disappoint you. When the expectations continue to rise, but progress is slowed, then there is a gap. Even as things are getting better, expectations can rise higher than what actually happens, and that gap leads people to get angry, and to people to get out in the streets, and people to say, I thought things were going to get better, and now they're not. They're not what I was told they were going to be, and I'm going to fight for this. And that is an idea that has some purchase. But what is it that generates this expectation? That's something cultural, right? There's what you actually experience, which is this thing that we receive all the time, but how we interpret it is based on culture, which, to go back to an introduction to sociology, a way of thinking about it is a set of values, what we believe is right or wrong, what ought to be, this vision of the way things ought to be, beliefs about the way the world are, which can change as history changes around you, and practices, the things we do. That sense of expectations for how things are going to be is cultural. And so we should start to ask the question, how does culture get transmitted? How do those messages get transmitted? And that is something that relative deprivation theory is kind of silent about. So there are theories that begin to move off the basis of this idea of deprivation, begin to say, take that idea that there are people who have reasons for engaging in social movements, as deprivation theory and relative deprivation theory suggest, and begin to look at the question of, well, yeah, but how does that actually happen? That people's expectations, that their beliefs, that their values, that their practices start to change. And how does that spread? How do you get that kind of cultural change to spread? Resource mobilization theory comes along. And it says, look, social movements are not just sets of individual people making decisions and just marching right out onto the street. Whenever there's some kind of activity that occurs that is successful and that we end up hearing about, it's because of positive, successful mobilization of resources. Because social movements are also organizations. Wishing and wanting and feeling change doesn't make for change. What makes change or organizations that are successful in any organization, like a business, like a church, right? Like a government, but also like a social movement organization, an SMO, emphasis on O for organization, needs resources to succeed. Any organization, any organized group needs to mobilize resources to succeed. And the idea is that social movement organizations are organizations just like any other. So what kind of resources need to be moved, need to be mobilized, need to be put into action? That is the next question that resource mobilization theory begins to ask. Well, you can have money. Money can be turned into a lot of things. You could have people with their skills, their voices, their time, right? So you need to be able to get people in. Now, they can be volunteers or they could be professionals, right? You can pay them or you could get them just to want to come and help. But you need people. You need some organizational framework, like Alden Morris in his History of the Civil Rights Movement is very clear about that these organizations need their structures, they need their bylaws, they need their rules, they need their membership lists. You need people who are ready to follow that you can activate. And how do you do that? You do that through network connections. Now, David Snow and a series of co-authors in a paper published in 1980 argue this point forcefully when they compare two religious movements that are attempting to solve what they consider to be the problems of the day through new to America religious movements, the Nichiren Shoshu Buddhist movement and the Hare Krishna movement. And the Nichiren Shoshu Buddhist movement has a difference from the Hare Krishna movement. The Hare Krishna movement says you need to relinquish your ties to people who are not in the movement, and you need to only associate with and be friends with people who are in the movement from now on. Nichiren Shoshu as a movement, this popular Buddhist movement involving chanting and other practices, says, no, that's fine. You can keep your old friends. In fact, invite them along. So that means, according to a resource mobilization theory, according to that perspective, that the network connection becomes an interesting resource to the Nichiren Shoshu Buddhist movement. And actually, they spread much more successfully through society, whereas the Hare Krishnas die out. Have you seen a Hare Krishna group anytime in the last 2 decades lately? No, not really. And why was that? You saw them for a while, a little bit publicly, but why was that? Whereas the Nichiren Shoshu Buddhist movement in the United States was much more quietly successful in gaining numbers. It's because very quietly, through existing social network contacts, which were a kind of resource to the organization, they pulled people in. Whereas the Hare Krishna movement, as a religious movement, said, nope, you have to cut off all your connections, and therefore you can't use them any longer as a resource to get people in, to help energize that movement as resources. So the Hare Krishna are reduced to, in trying to get new people, just going out into crowds at airports and in parks and just walking up to people they don't know. And it turns out that that's not a very good way to recruit people. It doesn't work because, as we learned from repudiations of Gustav LeBon's crowd theory and Kornhauser's mass society theory, it's not the disconnected people who join new movements. It's the people who are connected to folks who are already in the movement that join. So that's why Nichiren Shoshu succeeds, because network connections in your social network of people you know are useful. That's how people get pulled in to all kinds of organizations, churches, civic groups, private schools, and social movements. An additional final theory to consider is the theory of framing. And this is a return to the idea of convincing people, right? That people have reasons for joining, and that they're not just groups or organizations, but that the convincing happens within a context. And that context is the culture of the day. So culture is something that people are steeped in. We have different cultures. We We have an American culture that is broad, but we have a Maine culture within the state of Maine, for instance, that is more particular. We have a different way of doing things, practices. We have a slightly different set of beliefs. For instance, Maine is the least religious state in the country in terms of affiliation, people going to church. So we're a little bit different in that way than the rest of the country, on average. We have different values in terms of what we wear and what we do not wear in terms of clothes. We tend much more toward the gray, toward the dark colors, and not so much toward the bright. Those are some cultural differences. There are many more. Within Maine, there are different cultures. There's the Down East culture. There's the French culture. There's a new immigrant culture, more than one immigrant culture, as a matter of fact. And each of these, there's the coastal culture, there's the inland culture. Each of these has a different set of practices, beliefs, values. And each of those cultural contexts provides an opportunity to bring people into a movement because they are either congruent, absolutely matching with, compatible with, or at absolute opposition to the values, beliefs, and practices of a social movement of activists. And so, again, David Snow and some co-authors come up with this theory of framing to describe this practice by which people can be brought into a social movement or not. And the way they can do that is with the framing of a situation according to cultural values, beliefs, and practices. So, excuse me. In order to do that, there are 4 framing operations that are possible. The first is simply called frame bridging, and that is where you just build a bridge to a bunch of people who are out there who already agree with you. If you are part of a group of anti-war activists and you make yourself visible to some other people who are already against war, they already totally agree with you, and who are ready and looking for an anti-war organization, then all you have to do is say, hey, why don't you join us? And they'll say yes. You're just building a bridge to them and letting them cross, and they will cross on your own. The second operation is one of frame amplification, and that is where there's a series of people who really haven't considered joining your organization, your social movement organization, and you can nevertheless convince them to come over by making an argument. And what you make an argument about is values. You amplify the importance of those values and you connect them to the movement. So let's say that you are part of a pro-life movement against abortion in the United States. You might be able to engage in frame amplification by approaching a religious group where the religious group, whether it's a synagogue or a church, has a core belief in the sanctity of every life and that life begins at conception. You can make an argument that says if you believe those things, then that applies to the act of abortion. You convince such people that makes your cause relevant to those people, and then you can recruit such individuals. You can engage in frame extension. So let's say you're an environmentalist, right? And you're part of an environmental movement. And you're also trying to appeal to a religious organization. And the religious organization is like, no, let's say they're Christian. They're saying, no, we're just mostly about, Jesus and the God of the Old Testament. It doesn't say anything about fracking in there, right? Or coal mining. So sorry, we're going to go back to our worship. Well, you can say, all right, we understand you're not concerned about the environment per se, but maybe you have other beliefs and values, like you believe in God's creation, don't you? Oh, why, yes. Well, if you believe in God's creation, you might say, as the recruiter for this environmentalist organization, you might say, I'm not religious myself, but I know you're religious. I know you care about God's creation, that it needs to be protected. Oh, certainly, certainly. Well, what is the environment but God's creation? Oh, I see. And then you convince people to come over. In that, you are engaging in frame extension, where that's different from frame amplification, where you're simply saying, oh, if you hold these values, these are our values as well. You're saying, I know you don't hold our values, but you have some values within your religious context. And here's why they matter in this movement. You take people and you extend your frame to encompass theirs. You extend the sense of what you do to incorporate their culture where it didn't before. And that's called frame extension. And then there's simply frame transformation. And this might happen, say, between a pro-life and a pro-choice groups. You might try to gain adherence to, let's say, a pro-choice movement by saying to members of a pro-life movement, no, you're wrong, and here's why. And I'm going to have an argument with you. I'm going to convince you to reject your cultural beliefs and values and tell you why they're wrong, and I want you to engage in and adopting our beliefs, our values, our practices, and then joining our group. Now, which of those is going to be the hardest? Which of those is going to be the easiest? More effort is required for that transformation. The number of people who are ever successfully converted through directly engaging, arguing with someone, telling them, no, you're wrong, is pretty low. It doesn't never happen. It does happen from time to time, but it happens rarely and with requiring a great amount of effort usually. Extension also requires effort because the people who are being asked to join a movement of people they don't agree with on a lot of things or just don't understand why that's important are being asked to stretch their minds a little bit to see some connection that wasn't there before. A simple argument that says, you have these values, we have these values too, hooray, we're compatible, let's all get together is easier. And getting people to join who totally agree with you already, and they're just looking for a way to help, is the easiest thing of all. So bridging requires the least effort, the least time, all these resources, the fewest recruiters. Transformation requires the most. If you want to do some kind of small-scale mobilization and get a person to join. And that is a theory about how you build your argument within the context of mobilizing resources. It's also a strategic then theory about how you might want to think carefully about which kind of effort you want to extend your mobilization toward. If you have a limited amount of resources, move it towards bridging first. Then if you have some resources left over, a bit of amplification. Then if you have some resources left over, extension, trying to let other people and other groups with other cultures understand that for their own reasons they might want to help. And then if you have anything left over, try a bit of transformation, but don't bet on it too much because it's not going to be as successful as often, nearly as those other framing operations are going to be. Thinking about all these different theories of social movements helps us to think, therefore, in summary, about different reasons why people join, different reasons why movements succeed, where they do, when they do, in the geographic, economic, political, and cultural contexts of a moment. And if you are engaged in social problems work, which is the work to try to solve what you perceive to be a social ill, through building a social movement of activists, you need to think very carefully and clearly about which of these movements really, these movement theories, which really explains best when movements succeed or fail, because they tell you what to do in your day-to-day activities in order to make your particular movement, your particular push to have a social problem get attention and get political resolution, to have that succeed. pay attention to these theories and try to apply these theories, and you can have a greater likelihood of success in your social problems work as an activist.